when we first started thinking about doing a community read at the new Jim Crow, it was about 9 months ago. And there are many people who have put a lot of work into making this happen. And I was thinking this morning, 9 months, it feels like we've given birth to something here. So I just want to remind people, if you don't know about what this events will be over the next 7 months as we continue with this. If you got a book, there's a bookmark inside, and it has the monthly events that will be taking place at GIAC and will be led and hosted by a number of people in our community. Dr. Sean Eversley Bradwell is going to be doing the first one in October, and it will be a chapter a month. So if you are reading it by yourself, you're reading it in a book group, you can kind of pace yourself along with one chapter a month. Even if you're not going to read the book, or haven't read it, or don't intend to read it, you can still participate in all of these events. There are audio versions of the book, if you would like to listen, that are available at the library. But there's lots of ways to plug in if you happen not to be a reader. One of the exciting pieces of this whole project is that the author of the book, Michelle Alexander, will actually be in Ithaca February 21st. And Cornell is bringing her through the MLK Memorial Lecture Series. And I think it's going to be at the State Theater, is that right? So on the bookmark is the link to the Multicultural Resource Center, where you will be able to keep in touch with what's going on. So now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Stephanie Nevels.
Hi everybody, so my name is Stephanie Nevels and I'm a social worker here in town. I work at the Department of Social Services. I have 2 teenagers that I've raised here in Ithaca, and I'm also a longtime facilitator for the talking circles on race and racism, and I'm really excited to be here to moderate the panel and kind of guide us through our discussion this evening. So first we have Russell Rickford. Russell is an associate professor of history at Cornell University. He specializes in the Black radical tradition and Black transnationalism. He teaches classes on African American political culture, social movements, and 20th century U.S. history. Russell is the author of We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination. Next, we have Barry Briggs. Barry is a returning citizen. He is currently a mentor for the Ultimate Reentry Opportunity Program, and he is also starting school for business management and entrepreneurship through Kaplan University. Next, we have Nicole LaFave. Nicole is the mother of 3 gorgeous young children. She works at the Cornell University Public Service Center. Nicole is a member of the Ithaca City School Board. She is one of the founders of the local chapter of Black Lives Matter, and she also sits on the Ithaca City Police Board. Next, we have Rachel Everts. Rachel is finishing her bachelor's degree in Urban and Regional Studies at Cornell University. She is a non-traditional student and the parent of a 4-year-old daughter. Before coming to Ithaca to start her education, Rachel was on probation for drug offenses and has been formerly incarcerated between the ages of 16 and 18. Now she is one of the mentors for the Ultimate Reentry Opportunity Program. She is program coordinator for the Multicultural Resource Center. Lastly, we have Marjorie Olds. Marjorie is a retired city court treatment court judge. She was a judge for 12 years and was the region's first female prosecutor. Marjorie currently works in 2 prison projects, which she has created with Cornell, Ithaca Neighborhood Housing Services, Tatum Engineering, and New York State. Her family includes 6 grown kids, 6 grandkids, and 10 foster kids whom she's cared for over the years. So my first question is for Russell. What we would like to know from you is Michelle Alexander calls this the new Jim Crow. Can you give us a brief history of the old Jim Crow laws? When did they get created? What was their purpose? Why were they called Jim Crow? And when did they become illegal?
In Black Reconstruction, 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois stated that, quote, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back into slavery." Slavery was the first racial domain in the United States. During the era of slavery, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, most African Americans were property. Jim Crow was the second racial domain in the U.S. During the Jim Crow era, from the late 19th century to the 1960s, African Americans were second-class citizens. Today, a modern racial domain exists. Under the new Jim Crow of the late 20th century and early 21st century, many African Americans are relegated to the status of criminals. From property to second-class citizens to criminals. A racial domain is a system for reproducing white supremacy. A racial domain is a system for reproducing white supremacy. Let me briefly describe the transition from the racial domain of slavery to the racial domain of Jim Crow. Reconstruction was a brief period between slavery and Jim Crow. It was an attempt to rebuild Southern society based on the principle of black citizenship and equality. It was a short-lived experiment, and it marked the transition from one system of white supremacy, slavery, to the next system of white supremacy, Jim Crow. Reconstruction began after the end of the Civil War in 1865. Beginning in 1866, the Civil Rights Act extended citizenship rights to African Americans. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, outlawed slavery, guaranteed citizenship and equal protection for African Americans, and gave African American men the right to what? To vote. Reconstruction was a time of incredible accomplishments for African Americans. They sat on juries, they cast ballots, they helped establish public school systems. They served in Congress and held local offices, from sheriff to tax collector. They participated in politics. They created institutions, from churches to schools. But moments of rapid racial progress in the U.S. are always followed by periods of vicious backlash. Southern racists and other defenders of the status quo were determined to turn back the clock and reassert white supremacy in the South. While terrorist groups like the KKK were always opposed to black equality, members of the political and economic establishment also retreated from the principle of racial justice during the 1870s, especially as a bad economy shifted attention away from civil rights. By the way, the same thing happened in the 1970s, and in many ways, the same thing is happening today. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction had ended throughout the South, and the white supremacist Democratic Party was again in control of Southern politics. The end of Reconstruction meant the return of officially enforced white supremacy. The failures of Reconstruction were profound. Reconstruction failed to distribute land, or redistribute land. Why did African Americans want land? Autonomy. Economic autonomy, political autonomy. And a source of independence, a measure of compensation for years of stolen labor as slaves. Reconstruction failed to stamp out racial terrorism at the hands of the Klan, and it failed to provide access for African Americans to economic security. Some historians have referred to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s as a second Reconstruction, right? Why did they do that? Because the movement partially fulfilled some of the aims of the first Reconstruction in the 19th century. So one could describe the first Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution or a partially reversed revolution. And it would take the nation a century to fulfill some of Reconstruction's basic demands. Of course, many remain unfulfilled to this day. This is why we're here. Reconstruction was defeated by conservative lawmakers, wealthy financial interests, and racists who wanted to rebuild a white supremacist order. These and other groups helped create the era of Jim Crow, a period of history in which the racial system or racial domain relegated African Americans to second-class citizenship. The black historian Rayford Logan called the onset of the Jim Crow era in the late 19th, early 20th century the nadir. What does the nadir mean? Anybody know? Right, the lowest point of black life. I believe we're in a new nadir today in many respects. African American men were violently disfranchised. They lost the right to what? To vote. This was accomplished through various schemes, including poll taxes and literacy tests. African Americans were reduced to the lowest economic rung. They were forced into peonage or debt slavery. In urban areas, the vast majority of African American women worked as domestics or washerwomen, as many as 90% in some communities. 90%. I don't want you to Google when you go home the average wealth for a black woman in the United States compared to the average wealth for a white woman in the United States. You'll see that legacy of Jim Crow. Black men performed other forms of menial labor. The Jim Crow era was profoundly violent, as we know. To ensure the total social and economic subordination of African Americans, white supremacist mobs and vigilantes would routinely harass, terrorize, rape, beat, and lynch African Americans. Lynching was a means of maintaining social control. The centerpiece of Jim Crow was the legal system of segregation, or what I call American apartheid, the American version of what later became the racist apartheid system in South Africa. The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision of 1896 established the doctrine of separate but equal. The court ruled that racial segregation was legal so long as facilities for white and black people were equal. And as we know, this would not be the case. For example, for generations, in many southern counties simply lacked black high schools altogether. So black citizens were paid taxes for public institutions, public schools, from which they were excluded. Jim Crow was not just about separation. This is very important. I always stress this point with my students. Jim Crow is not fundamentally about separation. You have black people and white people in very close proximity throughout the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow is about subordination. It is about domination. Jim Crow laws and policies were designed to ensure that whenever African Americans and white people came into contact in the street, on the bus, in workplaces, African Americans were subordinate, subservient, and degraded. This is why Michelle Alexander refers to Jim Crow as a caste system, a system of rigid social hierarchy in which you are never able to rise above the class into which you're born, right? Like the old social caste system in India. In order to consolidate the racial caste system of Jim Crow, a racist criminal justice system was created. The 13th Amendment had outlawed involuntary servitude except for those convicted of what? A crime. The Southern white power structure used this loophole to recreate the system of slavery for black convicts who were rented out to mining companies and other businesses, and they were often worked to death. This was the profitable convict lease system. Other racist laws recreated the old post-emancipation black codes designed specifically to subordinate African Americans. So you see the kind of criminalization of black life that you see now in Ferguson. Fast forward 100 years. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s destroyed Jim Crow, the overt system of racial hierarchy, but moments of racial progress are followed by periods of vicious backlash. The new racial domain would help reverse black social, political, and economic progress of the civil rights movement, but would have to do so in the absence of a formal system of racial discrimination because the black freedom struggle and civil rights laws had dismantled Jim Crow. I have 2 more lines. The new Jim Crow, the new plan for criminalizing black life was and is mass incarceration. Like the old Jim Crow, the new system would appear natural. It would be defended as constitutional, inevitable, and just. And it would be perpetuated and reinforced by people, especially those who considered themselves liberals and who felt no particular racial animosity toward African Americans, but who practiced a vicious form of racial indifference.
Thank you, Russell, for that explanation of the old Jim Crow. So next we're going to move on to Barry. So Barry, what we would like to ask you is, what has your experience been as a returning citizen? What struggles and challenges do you face and how are they affecting you? And then also if you could give us an overview of the ultimate reentry opportunity, what that program is and what your role is in that program and how it's impacted your life.
I know some of y'all is looking at when she says returning citizens, but me and a couple of other people that came home, we don't like to be called felons or criminal or anything like that, so we like to be called returning citizens. For returning citizens, you don't know if we could have returned from Africa somewhere. So, well, my experience has been terrible, but turning out to be a wonderful journey. I have been through too much to talk about at this moment, but I can tell you that what I have been through, the average person would have hung it up already. Picture yourself in a world where everyone is speaking another language, where everyone looks at you different because your skin color already. Never mind the fact that you are a returning citizen and you have a record. So now that is 2 things you have against you. Okay, so now you are back in the world and you have to adapt to a new world, new technology. This world is forever evolving. I was scared. I felt as though I didn't belong in the world, and for a while I went in and out because I didn't know how to survive in the world anymore. When you are locked up, you don't have to worry about bills or where your next meal is coming from or how you are getting to your next destination. Mass incarceration is a subject that should be addressed with a little caution because you have a lot of men and women that have been accused and locked up due to the laws that was put in place in order to oppress and keep people oppressed. Do you think that because you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, you should be punished for it? I don't think that is the right thing to do. It's not about punishment no more. It's about how much they can make off each person that gets locked up for a certain amount of time. It is about money now. That is what makes the world go round, they say. My biggest challenges were employment, housing, and transportation. Housing has been my biggest challenge. I am currently homeless, and the struggle is real. I was denied by DSS to go to the shelter because they couldn't verify that I've been in the community. But since last April, the rescue mission has been my address. What do I have to be? On drugs or alcoholic to get help? The whole system is designed to be a long and dragged out process to get the returning citizens to fail. Think about it. If you have every returning citizen come home and successfully re-enter society, then jails and prisons, the biggest moneymaker in this world, would be shut down. Slavery still exists. They are paying returning citizens 10 to 15 cents a day to work in jails and prisons. If you have a degree, the most you are paid is 45 cents a day. You would work for that amount. Would you work for that amount? Now I want to talk a little about this program I am involved in, the URO program, Ultimate Reentry Opportunity. URO is fighting to change the system a bit to make it easier for the returning citizens, like myself, and make a successful return back into society. We have a mentoring program that I am proud to be a part of. I started off as a mentee, and now I am a mentor. We contact returning citizens while they are still locked up because that's where it all starts. We get them ready mentally to return into society. We prepare them for some of the obstacles they face. We are 1,000% there for the returning citizens. We are currently working on transportation, employment, and housing. We are asking the community and some of the more wealthy parties to come together and support URO. You will be supporting the housing, transportation, and care packages that we are going to be giving the returning citizens when they come home. We are asking for any donations to help us stop mass incarceration by helping the returning citizens successfully return back where they belong into society. I will leave you with this question. Your help has given me a support system that I needed to succeed this whole time. URO is my family now. Would you want someone to help you back up after you fell and made some mistakes in your life? This event turned out to be better than I and a lot of the others in this event expected. I would love to see all of you support and supporters for system change groups like URO. This is one step. The next step is doing the work. Thank you.
The term colorblindness. What do you think colorblindness means in terms of mass incarceration, and how do you think it possibly impedes the work towards undoing racism in general and undoing the mass incarceration system that we find ourselves with today?
In my opinion, colorblindness, it gives people an excuse to say that I am invisible and my experiences are invisible. In a perfect world, if we went back hundreds of years before the construct of race was created, it'd be great for us to say all lives matter. All it would matter to me would be to just be human, but for anyone to say that they don't see that I'm a woman or that they don't see that I'm black is just a complete lie. As someone who used to nanny, the 2 or 3-year-old child that I used to nanny would constantly say, you have brown skin. So for a grown adult to say, I don't see color, it's just like, but you do. So when thinking about what effect colorblindness has on undoing racism, it works in opposition to what we're trying to do in terms of, it tries to erase the history of race and racism. So when we're talking about the effects of incarceration on black and brown people, we're totally not acknowledging the impact that racism has had on black and brown people being in jail. So when we're talking about the new Jim Crow, we have to talk about the new Jim Crow, for me, provides this framework for why black and brown people are always surviving and not living. And I constantly think about that when I think about the film 12 Years a Slave, if any of you've ever seen that, when he's on the boat at the bottom and he says, I don't want to survive, I want to live. And I know many black and brown people in this town, in Harlem where I grew up, that are working hard every single day, and they can't get a break. And I'm sure there are many people in this room that know people that are trying hard every day. So I tend to think about FDR and the New Deal, and the fact that we went from slavery to the Reconstruction era to FDR's New Deal, where he created all these different legislatures that continue to cast black and brown people at the bottom. So when we think about how many black and brown people live in West Hill, how many black and brown people live in the North Side, it's not because they don't want to own homes, it's because redlining has created this system for black and brown people to lack the imagination to think about owning a home, because from generation to generation you have rented, and that imagination just supersedes you at a point. Being on the Board of Education, in many ways, making sure black and brown kids are striving as much as our white children is important to me. And again, when we think about Michelle Alexander's book, we have to think about how many years of repression and suppression black and brown kids have endured. So we think about the Board of Education case where black and brown kids were allowed to go to white schools, we can't think that after years of oppression that we can fast forward 50 to 75 years and that's going to undo all the racism that has happened. We can't read Jonathan Colesville's book, Savage and Inequality, and not say that we ignored all the black and brown teachers and parents that were saying that our schools were not good enough, and then have this white man come in and say, no, they're not. No, they're not good, because that continues to perpetuate this idea that whiteness has to affirm blackness. So with all that history, we can't sit here right now and say, I don't see color, because that's not real. And as a parent, my children are biracial. As much as I want to say, yes, you're half black and half white, fast forward 10 years when my children are stopped by a police officer, they're not going to see that half white. They see a young black man. However, there's a difference between perception and reality. And in reality, they're half white and half black, but that doesn't change how other people see them and how other people will treat them. So in this era of colorblindness, we're not having those conversations that need to be had, and by saying that I don't see color puts usually white people in this comfortable space to not have to listen to the stories and the narratives and the experiences of people of color. And if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not learning, because I think most of us on this panel right now that are people of color are uncomfortable every day. Working at Cornell University, which is a predominantly white university, I'm uncomfortable every day. When I walked into Target last night and there was a security guard following me for no reason, and I called him out on it, he was surprised that I A, advocated for myself, that I B, asked him why was he putting away deodorant in notebooks when he's a third-party source, and why he wasn't following the white woman who I had seen with her children put things into her purse. So while he's following me around, he's missing all the white people that are stealing things.
We're decoys.
Like you said, we're decoys. So in this era of colorblindness, if we continue to say that we don't see race, that also means that we don't see how many black and brown men are missing from our schools, that are missing from our workplaces, that are not being married, that are not seeing or walking their daughters down the aisle. So while you're sitting in your workplace and you're noticing it's all white and you're like, where are the black men? Most of them are in jail. So if you're saying you don't see color, then that means you don't see all those missing faces. It's a missed opportunity.
Okay, next, Rachel. My question for you is, given your personal experience, why do you think it's important for everyone here and everyone everywhere to read this book?
By reading this book as a community, it really gives us a chance to organize and mobilize on the issue of mass incarceration. She wrote this book to reveal the truth about what's going on in America. On the surface, we're in the age of colorblindness and the era of Obama, but colorblindness disregards our country's racial inequality, and which stems from our colonial past and the old Jim Crow. Underground, however, we are in an era of prison building and expansion into what Michelle calls a caste-like system. And in reality, prisons and jails and the criminal justice system, it acts less as a form of crime prevention than as a way to legalize discrimination through policies, laws, and practices that strip away basic human rights in the same fashion as slavery, except instead of discriminating on the basis of race, we label people as criminals. We need to dig deeper into the truth about mass incarceration. The war on drugs is a war on the poor. It is a political game and a response to white working class voters who felt threatened by the gains of colored people in the civil rights movement. This is front and center in today's political election. Over the summer, my friend and I took a trip down to South Florida, and we stayed with an older white couple. The husband was my friend's former coworker. We were sitting watching the news on highlights on the murders in Chicago. The coworker, he remarked, "What is wrong with these people? They have a choice to either stay in the ghetto or get out. And why are they participating in violence and drugs?" At the time, I didn't know how to respond. Despite knowing there was a serious mistake and flaw in his argument, today I lift up Dr. Martin Luther King's voice and quote, nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity.
Thank you, Rachel. Our last panelist is Marjorie Coles. And Marjorie, our question for you is, as a former city court judge and also in your current work with two prison programs that you helped develop, could you give us your personal and professional take on reentry and what can the community do to support those efforts and to help undo the situation we find ourselves in right now with mass incarceration?
Thank you. So in 1972, I taught in a secure facility. It was 21 years old. And that process of being with young people who at 14, 15, 16 were already in that groove led me to apply to law school. But in 1972, the recidivism rate for kids in secure facilities was in the 80 percentile or more. And it cost in those days a shocking amount, $40,000, $50,000 a year to incarcerate a young person. So on the way to law school, since I had already I'd been doing time with other young people who had really no place to go, we began becoming foster parents. And one of the things I noticed right away by the time we had a second foster child, I thought, I wonder if it's rare that these kids are in the system as foster children, but they've committed no crimes, no offense. They're in foster care because their parents had unmet drug, alcohol, mental health issues, exacerbated is a good word, exacerbated by poverty, homelessness, joblessness. So I went to Cornell Law School in the early 70s. I had 7 women in my class, no women faculty. It's a different world than today. And upon graduation, I became a prosecutor. And the court in those days was all white males. They had never had a female prosecutor before. I think there was one other female lawyer. And so I decided I'd do a unit of crimes of violence against women and children, sex crimes, domestic violence, child abuse. But early on, before I'd even heard the phrase war on drugs, I started noticing that so many of the defendants in the all-white courtroom, that there was a disproportionate number of young black males. And I also noticed that so many of the young defendants themselves were in the court system because of drugs, alcohol, and mental health issues. And I began thinking to myself, why is this system involved with these buildings and all these people and the indictments and the grand jury, when at the heart of the matter are these unmet needs that in this community we could figure out. So eventually I practiced law with Marty Lester. It was great to be with him. And I had my chance to go into family court. And by then we had like 8 or 9 young people who were lived with us, not all at once, for a period of 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years. And so often they would go to family court, and the results would be disastrous. And when I went and saw what went on, I saw young kids being packaged up and shipped out for no apparent reason, especially a disproportionate number of young African American children. So with a local friend and colleague, Susie Hatch, we decided, although we didn't know anything about writing grants, that we were going to write a grant and open up New York State's first Office of the Law Guardian, which has to have had about its 30th birthday by now. I mention that because in communities we can get together like tonight and we can think together and read together and we can problem solve. And sometimes it's just the simplest things. With the Law Guardian Office, seeing some of the young people at the book tables, how they, the Law Guardian Office was a base for the daycare council, those kinds of movements and parent involvement. But anyways, moving on. So when I was in the Law Guardian Office, I realized that not only are so many children pushed into the criminal justice system because their parents had unmet needs, and so many of the defendants that came through the DA's office were in the court system because of similar situations. But when I became a judge, and eventually a treatment court judge, which is a program to take people out of the prisons and out of the jails, I realized the missing piece, which was so many of the defendants had also been in foster care. And that just clarified so much I've been thinking about how when we break asunder the ties between family members and children are shipped off helter-skelter somewhere else where they lose their siblings, their feelings of security, and they're not only living in strange places and being moved, but they're also worrying about their parents. When we do that as a community, then the problems go on from generation to generation. I want to also mention that one of the greatest pleasures I've had in life was being on the McCormick Secure Board for many, many years. And the McCormick Secure Board, which is in our county, where young people are living in our community behind bars, growing of age behind bars. They're seeking board members, as is Finger Lakes Residential Center, also in our community. All of the kids who are incarcerated need a mentor or a tutor, and so many kids in the community need that. And whether you sign up through Cooperative Extension, the Youth Bureau's Big Brother, Big Sisters, Tompkins Literacy Partnership, there are so many ways you can work with young people.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, for your perspective and for all those great ideas of ways to get involved. So just another round of applause for